Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the Audit Committee meeting of the 9th of November 2017. I'd like to thank everybody for coming out. Is there any declarations of interest from committee members? No, hearing none. Thank you. Can we have confirmation of the minutes for the 12th of June, minutes, our 12th meeting, which was held on the June 22nd, 2017. Are the minutes confirmed, or is there any changes? Confirmed. Thank you. We'll now go through the consent agenda. Item number 1 is the Office of the Auditor General, report on audit follow-ups and detailed audit follow-up reports. The AG has a presentation, so we're going to hold that item. We also have a motion to add the supporting documentation pertaining to this report. So, Vice Chair Cloutier, if you could please read that motion.
Thank you, Chair. Merci, Monsieur le Président. Whereas the supporting documentation titled Office of the Auditor General Annual Report, Report on Audit Follow-ups and Detailed Audit Follow-up Reports was not circulated with the agenda package, be it resolved that the Audit Committee approve the addition of this document for consideration by the Committee at today's meeting pursuant to Section 89(3) of the Procedures Bylaw, being Bylaw 2016-377.
Is that motion carried? Thank you. And item number 2 is Office of the Auditor General 2018 Audit Work Plan. The AG also has a presentation on that, so we will hold that item. Item number 3 is the status update, Audit Committee inquiries and motions for the period ending 27 October 2017. Is this item received? Thank you. Okay, so let's begin with the first item. If you're ready, Mr. Auditor General.
We are. Thank you very much. Bonjour, Monsieur le Président et membres du committee. Good morning, Mr. Chair and members of the committee. I'd like to begin by, if I could, introducing the staff of the Office of the Auditor General. On my right, I'm joined by Executive Assistant Ines Santoro. Sorry, on my left. And on my right, I'm joined by the 2 Deputy Auditor Generals, Sonia Brennan and Ed Miner. And in behind us, we have our Senior Auditors, Suzanne Bertrand and Louise Prou, our 2 Auditors, Janet Anyango and Margaret Sue, and our co-op student, Paul Karam. The committee will remember that that we follow. Next slide, please. The committee will remember that that we follow the international auditing community's standards for the practice of audit, and that includes the practice of including all follow-ups in our audits. You'll remember that there are 4 stages to an audit: the planning phase, the fieldwork phase, the reporting phase, and we'll be back in at the end of November, where we will provide our annual report, the results of that phase, and finally the follow-up phase. And that's the purpose of today's meeting, why we're here today. We conduct follow-ups on all of our audits, and we generally wait about 2 to 3 years after an audit report is completed. There's no magic with that 2 to 3 years, but generally the time frame that is provided by management for the implementation of the recommendations is about 2 to 3 years. And if corrective action proposed by management is sooner, we'll conduct our follow-up sooner. And remember that our job is to ensure that the measures that were promised by management and approved by council have been implemented. So the Municipal Act states that the role of the Auditor General is to assist council in holding itself and the administrators accountable for the quality of stewardship and value for money. And for that reason, the audits themselves address the value for money, but the follow-up really is where we inform the Audit Committee and through the Audit Committee to Council management's progress on the implementation of those recommendations. The role of the job of the follow-up is not to provide an assessment of each individual recommendation, merely just our evaluation of management's progress on across all of the recommendations. So today we're going to be talking about follow-ups on audits that were tabled in November 2013 and March 2015, and there are 3 follow-ups. the audit of construction supervision, which was tabled in November 2013, the audit of specific contracts and processes in Fleet Services Branch, tabled in March 2015, and tabled on that same date was the review of city funding to Ottawa School of Speech and Drama. And those are the three follow-ups that we'll see today. I think we can say, based on the work that we've performed, that management has demonstrated a commitment to the audit process, and that they've addressed the bulk of the issues that were identified in those audits. When we speak about follow-up results, we break them down into four categories: complete, partially complete, not started, no longer applicable. And I think you can see that 71% of the recommendations that were addressed, 71% of the recommendations that were applicable are complete, and I think that's a good record. We're certainly satisfied with that progress. So we put all of the follow-up audits this time into the solid progress area, and the two Deputy Auditor Generals will take you through the individual follow-up reports, starting with Ms. Brennan talking about construction supervision.
Thank you. The original audit tabled in 2013 identified opportunities for improving the effectiveness of the construction supervision processes in several areas. Some of these included the inspections of critical water mains, posting bid opportunities more extensively, recording and evaluating vendor performance, and the change order process related to cost recoveries. 13 recommendations were made and agreed to by management. We have verified that 10 of the recommendations are fully complete, and 3 are partially complete at this time. Additional efforts are still required in a few areas. 2 of the partially completed recommendations are related to the application of a procedure to ensure that the reason for contract or change orders is documented to ensure cost recovery. While we found that the project managers were aware of the procedure and the requirement, there was a lack of compliance. Project managers had completed the forms required in only 2 out of the 10 projects that were reviewed. The intent of this procedure is to ensure that the city recovers its costs when warranted. The recovery value can be significant, which is why it is important that compliance in this area is improved. Infrastructure Services has indicated that they expect to launch a new project management system next year, and that it will include this procedure. The audit also recommended that the city document the performance of contractors and use this information when awarding new work. Since 2015, contractor performance has been evaluated and recorded. The recommendation will be complete when this new information is used as a factor in contract award decisions. Thank you.
Looking now at the audit of specific contracts and processes in the Fleet Services Branch, the original audit identified opportunities to improve management of the Napa Parts and Cal Tire contracts. 8 recommendations were made, and management agreed with all of them at the time. Since then, the Napa contract for management of the parts inventory was cancelled in 2016, and the activity was brought back in under city management. As part of this follow-up, I should say we did not test or review the analysis that was done supporting this decision. As a result of this change, 2 of the 8 original recommendations were no longer applicable. And then we found that 5 of the 6 remaining recommendations had been fully implemented. The one recommendation that we assessed as being partially implemented was to better monitor and control the tire program. The management of used tire inventory could be improved with better documentation of inventory counts, and as well, city staff need to assess the condition of tires being held by the service providers before disposal, as was recommended. The last audit follow-up we conducted was a review of the city funding of the Ottawa School of Speech and Drama. The original audit was conducted after, I'll refer to it as OSSD, ceased operations in February 2014. OSSD had received grants and loans from the city, and a portion of the loan had not been recovered when it ceased operations. In addition, A property developer had paid funds to OSSD as part of an application approved by the city for a building height and density exception in return for community benefits. The payment was not handled through the city's standard process for posting securities and making payments. The review's recommendations to improve policies and procedures and processes regarding payments related to community benefits under Sections 37 and 41 of the Planning Act were implemented, as was the recommendation to improve the management of cultural funding. The recommendation to improve monitoring of the Section 37 and 41 agreements was partially implemented. We found that payments were being monitored. However, the agreements do not contain an audit clause as was recommended in the audit. Thank you.
Donc, Monsieur le Président, nous pouvons conclure que le Bureau de vérification générale à la Ville d'Ottawa utilise des pratiques exemplaires et les suivis sont un élément important du processus de vérification. So in conclusion, Mr. Chair, we can say that the City of Ottawa Office of the Auditor General follows the best practice of using follow-ups after audits are completed, and we believe it is an important part of the audit process, and that management has committed to implementing council-approved recommendations. And in conclusion, I'd like to thank Mr. Kanellakis and his staff for the cooperation that they provided us through each of these follow-up audits. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Auditor General. Any questions from the committee? Councillor El-Shantiri.
Just a question to, first of all, thank you to the Auditor General and his team. Have we have any process in place for some of the company or construction company who fail to deliver on time, on budget, and then they pop up with a different name or different company numbers? Do we have a follow-up mechanism to make sure these, because we heard more than once, you know, it was a failure in this area, but then yet we see them under different umbrella or different name. Do we have a process in place where we can monitor those construction company?
Mr. Chair, through you to the council, I think that might be a question that's best answered by staff, perhaps Mr. Kanellakis or.
Okay, so to the city manager, I know you were speaking to the chair. That's okay. So the auditor consider maybe. Okay, go ahead. And who's he?
Mr. Chair, yes, we do have a process to monitor that. Not only are the scores recorded in our vendor performance program, but under the purchasing bylaw, the definition of supplier related to supplier performance applies to any associated companies as well as the directors of those companies. So if they did open another company and begin bidding, the past performance and any application of remedies would be applied to them as well.
So even if they try to change corporation name or number, you still have in process to identify those folks?
That's correct.
Okay, thank you.
Well, thank you, Councillor El-Shantiri. Councillor Manette.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. In the follow-up audit of construction supervision, you indicated that through your testing, you found that infrastructure services was not using the change order rationale it developed. What did the testing consist of, and were you able to determine any impacts as a result of this process not being followed?
Mr. Chair, through to Councillor Manette. We took a sample of project files and we reviewed them to see that the forms were required and were filled in. When the forms were not in the files, we did then check with management to see if they had been in another place or had not been filed appropriately. What we found was that the forms in those cases were not done. For the ones where we did look at potential impact of those, and there was not a significant impact for the ones that were not filled in.
And can you also explain which recommendation from the review of city funding Ottawa School of Speech and Drama, this was in 2015. I was just wondering what remains partially completed on that.
sorry, one moment.
No, no problem.
All right, yes. Sorry for the delay. What it is the agreements under Section 37 do not contain an audit clause, and we'd recommended that an audit clause be put in so that we could follow, the city could verify if need be, and that has not been put into those agreements. So that's what we're waiting on for full implementation.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. That's all for now.
Thank you, Councillor Manette. Vice Chair Cloutier.
Thank you, Chair Hubley. On the first audit of construction supervision, the second point, in some instances, part of the entire cost of the change order were due to consultants' errors and omissions, and I know that the audit deals with that. Related question, when there are changes due to staff requests based on a technical issue or a desire change issue, is there a business case that is done that is returned to the appropriate committee for approval of that, whether it be within the budget allocation or not? Or was that part, this was an audit that was done in 2012, and what is the status in terms of the business case for change orders?
Mr. Chair, we did not review that as part of this audit. In the follow-up, there weren't specific recommendations related to that. Management could possibly speak to that question.
Mr. City Manager, the business cases related to staff-generated change orders?
Where's Alan? There he is right there.
So, Mr. Chair, we do have a fairly rigorous process in place that's acknowledged in the audit related to project charters. So the project charters are really there to define basically the scope of the project. If there's any deviation from the scope, we also have a formal process in place in terms of the required approvals to be able to support any changes to the scope. So when we're talking about the change orders that is under recommendations 2 and 3 that are outstanding, those are actually change orders while the contract is ongoing. So let's say there's quantity overruns, for example, or rock that is encountered that was not foreseen, where we need to do a change to the contract itself. That's when the change order process would kick in. If it's a change in scope, that is a totally separate process. That's under a charter process. And all of our charters, in terms of the projects, are actually approved. The actual budget allocation is approved through the annual budget process.
So it would not go back to the appropriate committee?
If it exceeds the authority provided by council, yes, it would be going back to committee. If it's still operating within the authority that was provided for the project, it would be proceeding under delegated authority.
So that's with reference to the financial aspect, and that's important. But if there was change within the budget to the outcome, to the deliverable, to the something substantive, and I know that's a qualitative term, not a quantitative term, how would that be handled? Is that just at the charter level, or would that go back to committee?
If it is a substantial change, let's say that basically we've totally changed the limits of what had been approved in terms of, instead of rebuilding from A to B, we're rebuilding from B to C, and that had not been articulated in the budget approval, we would actually go back through that process to seek that amendment. If it's tweaking within the project itself, then basically it would proceed under delegated authority. We would also be discussing with the affected councillors in terms of the impacts to the project.
So I guess it's a definition of tweaking or substantive. That's a difficult.
Well, we respect the delegated authority bylaw requirement. So if it's outside of our delegated authority, then we'd basically be going back to council seeking that approval.
And Mr. Chair, if I may add to Mr. Gantier's comments, a good example of this year where we had a project where the scope changed substantially and we did come back to council was on the Prince of Wales reconstruction project, where there were unforeseen site conditions, significant geotechnical issues that changed the scope, and that came back for a further council approval. And we did at the time, during the midterm adjustment of numbers, explain the rationale for that project. So that's an example of where we would bring them back.
Thank you, Mr. Willis. Thank you, Mr. Gontier. Thank you.
Thank you, Vice Chair Cloutier. Councillor Wilkinson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I was looking at the partially completed. There's 5 of those. Are these ones that are actually positively going ahead, or is there stalling, or is there some problem why they're taking longer? Each of them has some.
Mr. Chair, I think we could characterize them as positively going ahead, just not complete at this point.
So you don't feel that these are any kind of thing to be worried about having them finished or not?
Well, we're always worried about lack of progress on promised deliveries, but if management has indicated that they're working to implement those a little later than planned, but nevertheless.
Do you have any examples of them? Because we don't specifically know which ones these are.
I think the one example was the funding under sections 37 and 41 of the Planning Act, where the promise was to include in those agreements an audit clause, which is pretty well standard in most city agreements. That doesn't yet appear in those agreements, and until that's done, we're showing that as partially complete, and we've been told by management that will be done in the near future.
It should have been fairly simple to put that forward, I would think.
It doesn't, certainly, since it's a standard clause that we have in many agreements that we have around the city, including our contracting documents. I'm not sure what the delay would be in implementing that particular fix.
So, Mr. Chair, it's management's opinion that where the city is the recipient of Section 37 money, and just for the record, we no longer collect Section 41 money. We don't do that anymore. But in Section 37, in accordance with the procedures and bylaws, council, the city itself is the recipient for the vast majority of those funds for city projects such as bike lanes. And we're already exposed to audit for any project we would do through, as we see today. What the Auditor General has recommended is when there is a situation, which are rare, where we are actually taking money in and giving it to a third party, that we would insert a standard clause related to audit, and we're committed to do that. And legal services will work with us, and those will, whenever it's not the city itself receiving the money, because where city receives the money, we're already exposed to audit. It's a standard procedure. But when it goes to a third party, there will be an audit clause. And in any going forward agreements, we've said we would do that.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Wilkinson. I just would like to congratulate the Auditor General and his team, as well as the City Manager, on these follow-ups. That this is good. To me, I see a lot of the recommendations have been adopted, and what we wanted to achieve with the audit is getting done. A couple of questions that I do have, and I'll start with the drama school. From the time of the audit to when you did your follow-up, was there any effort made to collect the outstanding funds? Any further investigation into what happened with those funds that you're aware of?
Mr. Chair, that would be outside the scope of our follow-up. Staff could respond to that, but my recollection was that they went bankrupt, in which case there was a low likelihood of recovery.
Oh, okay. And on the fleet management one, fleet services branch, in your follow-up you mentioned that the penalties do not increase the longer the delays remain outstanding. Was that a recommendation that be changed, that the penalties be scaled? Page 8, second last paragraph, it talks about, let's see here, there was almost $105,000 in delays, penalties. However, Under the current terms and conditions of the contract, penalties do not increase the longer the delays remain outstanding. I'm just wondering if there was a recommendation to change that, or if you'd like to speak to it. Is there an effort underway to change that? Because obviously it would help with reducing the penalties.
Thank you, Chair. Mary Gracie, Fleet Services. So that recommendation, if I'm correct, was made with regard to Napa. There was penalties related to where they were slower in bringing parts on and delaying work in the shop. And so what we have now is an internal standing offer setup. So the performance of those vendors we have now is managed through that contract, but it doesn't include as much service as the Napa one did. So it's managed a little bit differently, more as a supplier relation.
So less delays is what you're saying?
Yes.
So therefore you don't need to levy the penalties. But are you doing any penalties?
It would be to our own vendors, and we manage vendors on monthly meetings, and we're not having any difficulty at this time. If we did have difficulty, we can change vendors.
So in that case, Mr. Auditor General, would that recommendation be considered complete then? Or no longer applicable? Yeah.
In this case, it's no longer applicable because the outsourced activity has been brought in-house. But certainly we would certainly recommend that management ensure that they do have a mechanism in place to ensure that suppliers perform to the terms of the contract. And staff has indicated that they always have the option of changing suppliers, and that's certainly one option. But another option that could be built into contracts is a penalty clause for non-performance without the need to change vendor.
Okay, thank you. Okay, thank you both. Now, one last question would be for the city manager. We talked about when we track and report on contractor performance. What I'm not clear on is that will that list of substandard performance be public? Will we be publicizing the names of the contractors that we're having trouble with, or is it going to be an internal list?
I actually don't have an answer for that, Chair. I'm not sure. Rick, would you be able to shed any light whether we can make it public?
With regards to the list of companies and that?
List of companies that did not perform as they stated they would in the contract, and I know I'm just wondering whether that would go public, or would it just stay internal so that it would affect their ability to bid on other projects?
Yeah, it could have some negative effect, obviously, on their commerciality with regards to other contracts outside the city. Generally speaking, though, corporate names are not personal information under Freedom of Information, so they would be public. But it would be the way we would craft the message. If the committee wanted me to look at that, I can do so, Mr. Chair.
Okay, maybe what we'll do is have a discussion about that. Like, we might want to track how many companies that might apply to before we decide to do something. Okay, thank you. Thank you both very much. Did you, on that report, is it received? Yeah. Recommendations are carried. Sorry. Okay, carried. Come in. All right, and so item number 2, Mr. Auditor General.
As usual, Mr. Chair, we generally begin by reminding the committee of the processes that we follow in the Office of the Auditor General. And this time, je peux dire qu'une organisation qu'on utilise pour donner l'avis le Bureau de vérification générale, c'est le Committee of Sponsoring Organizations. Et on discute des gestions de risques d'entreprise, contrôle interne et prévention de la fraude. Nous pouvons dire que le système de contrôle interne a 5 composants. Normally we begin each of our meetings with the committee to inform them of the aspects of the audit processes that are followed by our shop and who provides that direction. Today I'm going to talk about the Committee of Sponsoring Organizations, affectionately known in the audit world as COSO, and they provide guidance on audit processes to the audit community. They talk about things like enterprise risk management, internal control, and fraud deterrence. And this past June, they released a document entitled The Integration of Enterprise Risk Management with Strategy and Performance. COSO talks about the 5 components to the internal control system. And here we would talk about the control environment, which includes certain things that we definitely have in place here at the city, integrity and ethical values, a board of directors, which would be a control and our audit committee, a risk assessment process, and I think the committee is well aware that the city has a enterprise risk management system, and the foundation of the determination of the items that are included in our audit work plan are objectively based on a risk assessment that we ourselves perform. Then, of course, there's the information systems which exist in the department, including the financial information system, the HR information systems, control activities such as the policy and procedures that exist around the corporation, and then the ongoing monitoring. And that monitoring includes things like the audit process. I should point out that risk assessment isn't just it's not just a list of risks. It's practices that are put in place to actually manage those risks, and it's for that reason that staff have implemented an enterprise risk management system, and then in the Office of the Auditor General, we rely on risk so heavily in not just determining the subjects of our audit, but when we move into an area to conduct our audit, we use detailed risk assessments to identify the areas that we will focus on. So COSO talks about integrating risk with strategy and performance, and they begin with the assumption that management is responsible to manage risk, and with an understanding that enterprise risk management is much broader than internal control, and that it should be a part of the planning process across the city. And as I've said earlier, we incorporate risk in the development of our audit work plan and as we conduct our work. So, le plan de travail est présenté annuellement et la méthode appliquée pour élaborer le plan de vérification comprend des entrevues avec les membres du conseil et des cadres supérieurs, l'examen de la documentation budgétaire, l'examen des vérifications précédentes et aussi nous examinons les vérifications et des plans de vérification des autres municipalités. So we're here to talk about our audit work plan, and we come to you each year. And this year, as in previous years, we met with members of council and members of senior management. We reviewed the budget documentation. We reviewed previous audits. We looked at the audits and the work plans from other municipalities. And we meet with our audit staff at the beginning of the audit planning process and share with them the areas that we would like to focus on, and we get their feedback. These are the auditors who are actually going throughout the corporation doing the audit work, and then of course we meet with our own staff after we've conducted interviews with senior managers and councillors before we come to before we put the final list together. We meet with the external auditors and review any management letters that they've prepared. And then, of course, we assess the programs and services against various selection criteria, which includes the size of the budget, the number of FTEs that would be in that area, and any fraud and waste hotline reports that we've received in the past while. So this year, Mr. Chair, the specific areas that we will be looking at, we will conduct an audit of benefit processing. This is the contract that manages the drug, healthcare, and dental benefits for the city. That will be a compliance and program management audit. We will conduct an audit of city leases. That will be a performance and operational audit. And here we're talking about city properties that are leased to others to carry on either city activities or non-city activities, and we'll be looking at how those leases are managed by city staff. We'll look at the audit of we'll perform an audit of the City of Ottawa Superannuation Fund. This is a a legacy from prior to amalgamation for those workers that contributed to a pension plan that was in place prior to OMERS. That'll be a compliance audit. We intend each year over the last couple of years, we've looked at the areas of risk that we saw in relation to the light rail project. And this year we'll look at the land negotiations and purchases from the light rail project, and that'll be a compliance type audit. Council and committee would be aware that we have found instances in the past where the land purchasing policy wasn't completely complied with, and thus it's an area that we will audit. We looked at audit. We'll be auditing fire services. That'll be a performance audit. It's an area with about 1,000 FTEs and a budget of $160 million. So that alone would attract the attention of our office. And it's an audit. It's an area that hasn't received much attention from the Office of the Auditor General. There are aspects of planning services that we will conduct an operational audit of, and staff estimates. And by staff estimates, I think committee and council are certainly aware of the number of estimates that are provided by staff to support decisions that council has to take based on recommendations made by staff. So it could be when in the past we've looked at the estimates that were provided for the Orga-World program, for example. We have estimates for the life of various city assets, including landfills. We have estimates of ridership, estimates of attention at city activities, estimates of pretty well every activity the city does. Staff must come up with estimates to support their analysis, and for that reason we'll be looking at those activities. Can't say at this point in time which estimates we'll look at, but it's that process. We're looking to see some robust procedures around those processes. There'll also be a number of follow-up audits that we'll conduct, specific areas of the Infrastructure Services Department, the audit of the automated meter reading project, audit of Byward and Parkdale Markets, the Environmental Services Department, the audit of Service Ottawa. We will also follow up on a fraud investigation report that was completed, that was tabled in 2017, but was to be completed by Q4 of 2017. So we'll look at the Client Service Center deposit shortages. We've got a significant amount of work in process, and we list that in the document, and I encourage the members of the committee to go through those. There's some work in process that I would like to bring to the attention of the chair. The audit of compliance with legislated ambulance services was deferred to the fall of 2017 due to new legislation and implementation of a new system that was put in place. We're in the process of doing that now, and there's a number of 2017 audits that we've started, but some of them have name changes because of the reorg, and that would be the audit of social housing registry. That was brought to my office at the request of Councillors Fleury and Hubley. The audit of corporate security, audit of recreation, culture, and facility services department, the audit of public works and environmental services, and then of course we have previously scheduled follow-ups. There's about 14 of those also listed in the material. Now there were a number of fraud and waste hotline investigations that are in process. Committee would be aware that we had started to conduct a review of long-term care homes in the summer, and we were then informed that the province had approached staff with a number of findings from their investigations with some orders, and we'd agreed to defer that work, and we'll be going in there in the new year. And we're finishing a review of the city's practices for the procurement of commercial vehicles, which also came out of the Fraud and Waste Hotline. There's some work that will be done based on external contingencies, and there I'll remind committee and council that we were directed by council to review the staff analysis of the examination of the Orgaworld contract. The Spring Hill contract was, the Spring Hill audit was quarantined because of ongoing litigation. At this point in time, that audit's quite dated, and what we're proposing is that we will go and do a review as well as a combined follow-up, because given the time that's passed and the changes in the activity, it just makes more sense for us to go in there and do an updated review. And of course, the follow-up to the source separated organics contract, the Orgaworld issue. So other than that work, the other work that we do, of course, is we send management letters directly to management. They don't; those are items that are of lower importance that we believe is important enough to us to bring to management attention, but don't appear in an audit report and thus aren't followed up on. We, of course, administer the city's fraud and waste hotline. We conduct our own analysis, and we expect that there'll be a quality assurance review of our activity conducted by the audit committee. I should point out, remind the members of the audit committee that when we go into each area to do our audit, the areas that we always include where applicable are succession planning, because of the importance of the continuity of the organization, any potential savings, and of course occupational health and safety. I spoke previously about the reports that are being held at the advice of the city clerk and solicitor. So our next steps, Mr. Chair, will be to prepare our work assignments, contact the city manager's office, and to schedule those audits over the next year. And I think we've got an aggressive schedule, and we're eager to get started. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Auditor General. Is there any questions? Councillor Deans.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Well, let me start by thanking you, Mr. Hughes, for including the audit of light rail land negotiations and purchases, that compliance audit in this year's work plan. As you know, it's something I've been very interested in having you do, and kind of been on you for a couple of years about that, so I'm really happy to see it here, so thank you for that. The second issue that I wanted to raise is the audit of staff estimates, and you sort of broadly spoke about that, but you didn't give any specifics of which ones that you're committed to doing. So two that I'm particularly interested in. One is light rail, transit, the ridership estimates. I really think that that's important for us to have a solid sense of how those estimates are arrived upon. And the other one that I'd really like to see, and I think it's quite timely, is the audit of budget requirements, because we're in the budget right now, and we're seeing questions about are the numbers sustainable, and I think budget requirement audit would be very interesting for all of us and informative and help us do our job. So that's my suggestion there. I hope you'll take it. I'm really here today because in looking at the document that we provided, what seemed to be missing was the systems audit of long-term care homes. And I know you spoke about it, but it's not in the document that you're doing it. And I agree that it makes sense to wait until Mr. Fougere is finished with his work, but it seems to have been eliminated from the page. So if you could just put it back, that'd be great.
Mr. Chair, through you to the councillor, first of all, thank you for your recommendations for staff estimates. Once again, we haven't determined which estimates we'll look at, but the ones that we select will be based on criteria which include risk. And so addressing your question with long-term care, the fraud and waste investigation that we were scheduled to conduct in the late summer in long-term care is going ahead, and it'll be starting in January. And it'll be different than, it perhaps will be different than the work being done by Mr. Fugere. We'll certainly be meeting with him. Not entirely sure what the scope is of his work, other than what I've read in the media, but certainly would be interested in what he's looking at. We have the ability, if to conduct investigations for things that come out of the Fraud and Waste Hotline, and we had already started to do this investigation that we've put on hold. And when we get into long-term care, knowing what we know already and knowing what has been provided to us, I wouldn't necessarily rule out any other investigation.
Okay. So what I understood that you were going to do is what I thought was called a systems audit, where you would look at things like how information is transferred from one nursing staff to the next at a shift change, how medication is administered, all of those systems that are in place inside the home. Is that what you're going to look at?
Mr. Chair, through you to the councillor, our preference is to, so that we don't affect the results of our investigation, to provide as little detail as possible as to that investigation at this time. We will report back to committee and council after we're done our investigation. I would rather not disclose that at this point in time. Okay. The risk is that it would affect the results. Okay.
I'm willing to respect that. And the other thing, when you visited the councillors and asked for suggestions for audits, the one suggestion that I made that I don't see here in any of the documents is an audit of Ottawa 2017. There was a lot of money spent. There's been very little transparency or accountability around that money, and I think it would be very timely to do an audit of 2017 and 2018.
Mr. Chair, through to the councillor, if I provided a list of all of the audits that I was asked to do by senior managers and members of council, it would be a very long list, and we don't have the resources to do it all. And when we decide what is going to be on our list, risk comes into it. And but at the same time, there's also some work that we have to do because it hasn't been done in a long time. So that's certainly an important issue, and it hasn't made the list. You're quite right. But I do remember talking to you about that.
Well, I think that's really unfortunate, because I think in terms of transparency here, it's important to do those sorts of things in a timely fashion. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Deans. Councillor Cloutier.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Just a couple of questions. On page 2, the fire services audit, can you tell me a little bit more of that in the context of, is the fire department not audited or to get its certification by some sort of international alliance or North American alliance of fire departments? And my question is this doubling up on that work that I believe the fire department is already subject to?
Mr. Chair, through you to the Vice Chair, it's an excellent question. Yes, you're right. There is a certification process that the fire department undergoes, and I can tell you that when we looked at one of the planned audits that we were scheduled to do in public health, we were made aware of a certification process that they'd undergone. We looked at that certification process, and we found that there were that it was a rigid process that they followed, and that the independent body that conducted that certification process was well recognized, and we made the determination to not complete that audit, and we'll be coming back to council to committee with that report. I'm aware that there's a certification process in fire services, and we will look at the certification process that they've undergone, and that may very well cause us to look in other areas of fire services, depending on how robust that certification process is, and if it addresses the issues that we identify in our own risk analysis. But the fire services is a large department with many activities, with the 1,000 FTEs that they have, and the $160 million that is dedicated through the budget process. And they're given its size and the activities that they conduct, there are likely areas that even if we were to determine that the certification process was adequate, there would likely be areas that we would still look at. But I'm not going to. I can't predict what those could be at this point in time, because we haven't started to plan that audit yet. But that's a good question.
Okay, thank you. On page 3, part of your follow-up audits, the audit of the Byward and Parkdale markets. Recently, the structure, the governance of the Parkdale and Byward markets was changed to a municipal corporation. That impacts your follow-up. Might we see there some recommendations, and I know this is a follow-up, some recommendations that were made as part of that audit that would be not applicable anymore given the new governance structure?
Mr. Chair, the Councillor is correct. There might be aspects that, with the change in the government structure, are no longer applicable. But as I recall, there were findings in that audit that would still be applicable, not just within that area, but in other parts of the city.
Thank you. No other questions? Councillor Elson-Turd.
I'm sure that the Auditor General expects me to ask the question again. So Spring Hill been so long, even the first audit is no longer valid. Now you're saying we're still in a legal penalty box, whatever the term is here. So where are we at? I mean, this item, I think, been survived. You're the third auditors, and we haven't seen result about it yet.
Mr. Chair, that's given the date of the work that was done, and given the fact that audit was quarantined for so long because of litigation. Well, I understand that the litigation is complete or nearly complete. That's why what we will do is, what we're suggesting is that we go in and do a review of the Spring Hill landfill, and at the same time follow up on the issues that were raised in that audit, and we will report back to committee with that. And there would be no reason for our work to be quarantined in any way, because it would the work will have been done currently, and we're not addressing the contract litigation in any way. So it's an important issue that has hung around for a long time, and in our view, the best way to address it is to conduct a review and address the current issues that affect the ongoing operation of that facility.
How long back you'll be able to go back to the beginning? Because I think the first request for audit came in 2005, or if I'm not mistaken, or 2004.
Generally, when we look, when we conduct an audit or review, we look at the current year and a couple of years prior. The value of going back and looking at something that happened 12 years ago, I'm not so sure that there would be a lot of value there. But through the follow-up of, if we can at the same time conduct a follow-up of that original audit, we would certainly be addressing any deficiencies that would have been identified in relation to the activities back in that time period, if that helps.
I think I'm looking at maybe Mr. O'Connor can help me to understand this. So if someone or his organization have some legal litigation, so that means they don't get audit. So that's one way to to hide behind the litigation of whatever the litigation is and not to be audited for 12 years. Like, I mean, really, I'm not sure how long we're supposed to be waiting as elected officials to understand what's there in that operation, because that's a legacy from the amalgamation, and I think we have the right to know how and what and what's our option here. But I mean, just to say we have a legal litigation, we are litigated, we are talking, we are speaking. I mean, seriously, 12 years? I'm not sure, Mr. O'Connor, if you have any time on this file.
Mr. Chair, that litigation was settled more than a year ago. The Auditor General and I did talk about the existing quarantine audit. He wanted to refresh it and bring it up to date. So there's no legal issue at this point in time with regards to this audit.
So when do we expect something from the auditor then, if it's no more legal issue?
If we conduct a new review and update the issues and do the follow-up, it would be our next reporting in our next reporting cycle.
In the next report.
The next reporting cycle.
Okay. Thank you, sir.
Sorry. For clarification for the councillor, the next reporting cycle would mean you'd be reporting out in 2019, or?
My suggestion is if we conduct a review and an update and a follow-up, it's something that wouldn't wait for an annual report. We could come to audit committee through one of the audit committees where we bring follow-up reports.
That's good. Okay. Thank you very much, Mr. Councillor Al-Santirian. Mr. Auditor General, I have one question which I think I've asked numerous times in the past. I see in here that you're going to do the cost analysis on the Orga World piece, which you were asked to do, I think, in the summer of 2014. Is that correct? Just to clarify, Mr. Chair, we did a cost analysis of the Orga World contract in the audit that came forward in July 2014. What was recommended in the audit and what was promised management's response to that recommendation was that they had agreed and that they would conduct a cost analysis to determine whether or not the Orga World contract should continue and whether they should take advantage of the termination clause. The issue, of course, at the time was the ongoing litigation with Orga World, and the request that was made of my office by council, and we took it as direction, was if we would consider reviewing that analysis prepared by management, and we said that we would. And of course, we can't review that analysis until it's done, and I would have to say that the city manager and I have talked about this pretty well every meeting that we have, and we meet on a monthly basis. And I understand that work is being done on that analysis, but perhaps you're better to get an update from the city manager.
Well, Mr. Chair, the Auditor General is correct. I mean, as you know, the Orga World contract is in litigation. We have been in discussion with company representatives about how to move this forward while the litigation has been ongoing. And we are endeavoring to do that work to meet the direction of council and be able to share that with the Auditor General prior to any resolution of this file. That's our intent.
Thank you, Mr. City Manager. I have to say, though, at some point we have to fish or cut bait on this contract. So do we have a sense of, are we going to get there in the next year, the next 2 years? Because this contract could expire before we take a look at whether it's in the taxpayer's best interest to cancel the contract or not. Correct? And my concern is, since this audit came out in 2014, we continue to pay or overpay, I think is the right term, for this contract, And at last report, we're still at only about a 40% diversion rate, so that tells me we're not putting in anywhere near the product that we're paying for. So I'm just wondering, is there some interim measures that we can work out with this company to try and protect some of the taxpayers' money involved in this until you can come back to council with a report on whether we should cancel this contract or perhaps amend this contract to make it much more favorable for or balanced for taxpayers?
Mr. Chair, well, we've had a very wet year, so we are going to meet our put or pay. I mean, our projections are we're going to surpass that, so we aren't going to be paying for something we didn't deliver, number one. Number two, to amend the contract or to look at things that could mitigate some of the exposure that we've had from the other contract is challenging while we're in litigation and while we're having discussions, because they obviously are pursuing legal course, and that's wrapped up into the discussions about how can we move away from that and come back with a revised agreement. As for the time frame, I don't think it'll be another couple of years. I'm hoping that we will be able to, before the term is over, bring something back to committee and council that represents where we're at with our discussions and where we're at with the litigation.
Thank you. And if you manage to do that, I think that'll go in the books as another Steve Kanalakis miracle. So thank you. Thank you, Mr. Auditor General. That's my questions on the report. Let's see here. So is the recommendation on the work plan carried, committee? Thank you. And so that's it. Are there no in-camera items? Any notices of motions? We're good. No inquiries? Other business? Motion to adjourn? And the next scheduled meeting will be Thursday, November 30th, which will be our regular as well as our budget meeting. Thank you.